Hi everyone, welcome to the channel Sluggers Blue for your CAT VRC preparation. In today's session, we'll be taking up an RC that was asked in your CAT exam in the year 2019. In the second slot, I've titled the RC as British Colonial Policy, 526 words and 5 questions, so quite standard for CAT. So in this part of this session has two parts. In this part, I'll be taking you through the passage in quite some detail, and in the next part we'll be doing the questions. Okay, so let's start. Okay guys, so now the way we'll go about understanding the passages, well, your screen is, as you can see, is divided into two parts. On the left side you have the passage, and on the right side you have this space where schematic diagrams will appear as I read the passage for you. We'll go paragraph by paragraph. I'll read the paragraph. There'll be some schematic diagrams will appear alongside as I read the paragraph, and then I'll explain the paragraph using the schematic diagrams, and then we'll do the same for every subsequent paragraph. Okay, so that's how we'll go about it. All right, guys. So let's start with the first paragraph, first part of the first paragraph. British colonial policy went through two policy phases, or at least there were two strategies between which its policies actually oscillated, sometimes to its great advantage. Okay. The first sentence, all that the author has tried to say here is that, well, the British colonial policy was mainly based out of was mainly based out of two strategies. You know, they either went through two policy phases, or you can say that there were just two strategies between which its policies, you know, oscillated. So either they'll deploy the first strategy or they'll deploy the second strategy in their policies. Okay. So let's note this as your, let's say this is your strategy one, let's say this is your strategy two. So the British colonial policy was mainly based on this. That's what the first sentence says. Let's come to the next part. At first, the new colonial apparatus exercised caution and occupied India by a mix of military power and subtle diplomacy. Okay. Now the author simply says that at first, while the during the first phase of conquering the country, of conquering India, the British colonial apparatus. So again, British colonial apparatus is a reference to the Britishers. Exercised caution. They were cautious. So they deployed the first policy, right? So in the earlier sentence, he talked about the one of the two strategies between which the British colonial policy oscillates, and then he goes on to describe how the Britishers deployed the first strategy when occupying India, right? It says that at first the new colonial apparatus, they exercised caution. They were cautious, right? This was the first policy of being cautious, and occupied India by a mix of military power and diplomacy, right? So they used a mix of military power and wherever applicable, sometimes military power, sometimes diplomacy, to acquire India, right? To acquire India. The high ground in the middle of the circle of circles. Now, guys, so far as this particular phrase is concerned, the high ground in the middle of the circle of circles, what exactly does the author mean by this, and how does this relate to the context here, is something that I'll take up once we have completed the whole paragraph. And there's reason for that, because this phrase requires uh, information that is, at least to some extent, from outside the purview of the passage. No, but don't that doesn't mean that it will it will create problems for you to answer the questions, because there are no questions which have been asked directly from this part, from at least from this line, right? So no, it won't create any problems in terms of answering the questions. But yes, this is something that we'll take up once we've understood the whole paragraph. I'll explain what exactly did the author mean by saying that, while they occupied India at the middle ground in the middle of the circle of circles. What exactly does that mean? Okay, so we will take this up slightly later. Okay, once the paragraph is done. Let's come to the next part. He says, this, however, pushed them into contradictions. What pushed them into contradictions? Deployment of the first policy, of the first strategy as a policy, where they were cautious and occupied the high ground, or occupied India by a mix of military power and diplomacy. This application of the first strategy, this put them into contradictions. Okay, all right. That's so far so good. Let's move on. And what were the contradictions? It's going to describe what the contradictions were. For whatever their sense of the strangeness of the country and the thinness of colonial presence. Okay, so whatever they believed was with respect to how strange they found the country India to be, and how thin was the colonial presence in this country, right? Right. So how much ever strange they may have found the country, or how much ever thin they figured the colonial presence in India was at that point of time, irrespective of that, the the British colonial state, irrespective of that, the British colonial state represented the great conquering discourse of Enlightenment rationalism entering India precisely at the moment of its greatest unchecked arrogance. Okay, so what the author is trying to say by these lines here is that, well, for whatever their sense of the strangeness of the country, or their perception about the thinness of the colonial presence in India might have been, still we need to consider that the British colonial state represented the great discourse, the great colonial discourse of Enlightenment and rationalism. What does the author mean by it? The British colonial state representing the great colonial discourse of the Enlightenment rationalism. What the author basically means here is, guys, so there was a period of, you must have heard of the Renaissance or the Enlightenment era, right? In the, I'm not sure about exactly the centuries, but at least 300 or 400 years before now, right? Which was almost kind of a revolution, that it was an intellectual revolution in a sense, that swept through Europe, and Europeans as such, the colonizing countries, the colonial powers of Europe, including the British, they figured that, they inferred from that they had an intellectual high ground with respect to the rest of the world, and hence they went on to go on and colonize all the territories across the world, right? So this colonization of territories, this discourse of colonization, this great colonization discourse, arised out of the Enlightenment rationalism, out of the Renaissance era. Okay, and the British colonial state was the representative, at least so far as the Indian subcontinent was concerned at that point of time. It was the representative of this great colonial discourse of colonizing all countries based on Enlightenment rationalism, and based on the idea that these countries were that had an intellectual upper hand, right? So that's what it means. So for whatever the British colonial state might have considered India as being a strange land, or India as being or figuring that there was hardly any colonial presence in India, and hence maybe we should not do much with that. Maybe we should be cautious. Maybe we should deploy diplomacy. So whatever they might have considered here, still we also need to. It happened to contradict with their inherent philosophy, which, because why? Because they essentially represented the great colonial discourse of Enlightenment rationalism, which was in the process of conquering everything across the world, right? So that's what he means. Coming to the next part, as inheritors and representatives of this discourse, so the British colonial state was the inheritor and representative of this discourse, right? Which carried everything before it, right? So this discourse, this great colonial discourse, was so inertial, so heavy in inertia, that it transformed everything that came in its way. Okay, it carried everything before it. This colonial state, right? Because it was the British. Let's read the whole sentence together. As inheritors and representatives of this discourse, which carried everything before it, this colonial state could hardly adopt for long such a self-denying attitude. What does the author refer to by saying self-denying attitude? The expression self-denying attitude is basically a reference to this uh, application of the first strategy, where the Britishers had been cautious. Okay, let's occupy the country with diplomacy and some military power, but let's not interfere much. That was the first strategy, right? And it was not able to keep up with that. That strategy ended up being contradictory to it. Okay, so as inheritors and representatives of this discourse of great colonizing discourse, they found it difficult to adopt such a self-denying attitude for so long? Okay, it had restructured everything in Europe. The British colonial state had restructured everything in Europe, had already restructured everything in Europe. Okay, and the, and then what were those items that it had restructured? He gives a list: the productive system, the political regimes, the moral and cognitive orders, and everything, right? And would do the same in India. And would do the same in India. That means it will not be able to uh, sustain with the self-denying attitude, sustain with the cautious attitude after having conquered India, and then will bring about the changes on similar lines as it had done in the case of Europe. Okay, particularly as some empirically inclined theorists of that generation considered the colonies a massive laboratory of utilitarian or other theoretical experiments. And particularly, and this would also like another factor that would add to this idea of the British bringing about drastic transformations in the in India, would also be how how many scientists, how many empirical he says that how many empirically inclined theorists, inclined theorists means theorists who are inclined to to base their theories on experimentation and data. So how some empirically inclined theorists of that generation believed that the places which these the colonizers, right, the Britishers acquired, these were nothing but just massive laboratories of utilitarian and other theoretical experiments. So what he's saying is that this also became it also became quite apparent that they will go on with the drastic transformations, because many theorists in that generation also considered the colonies to be a laboratory where they can test their ideas of utilitarianism, or where they can do some theoretical experiments, right? So yeah, so that's what he means. So these were the factors. So what the author has done here essentially in the first part of the first paragraph, I've just taken the first part of the first paragraph, okay, so far. He's talked about the two strategies of the British colonial state, how they started with the first strategy and conquered and occupied India, and how they were not able to stick with this strategy of not interfering much, okay, of trying to keep away and just settling for having acquired the country and settling with the eminence. Okay, we'll just take the high ground and let the people, let everyone do whatever they're doing on the ground level. Will not interfere on in the ground level activities there. We'll just take the high ground here and take eminence. So they were not able to settle with this. How they were not able to settle with this, and then they actually, and what were the reasons due to which they anyways they ended up transforming, going ahead with the transformation of the country. Okay, so yeah, that's now that's the explanation of the first paragraph. Now coming back to, as promised, let me explain to you what these lines mean. Okay, okay guys, so the line is says the high ground in the middle of the circle of circles, right? We'll try to understand this now. Now before I go on and explain what exactly did the author mean by this line, and especially by the phrase here, the circle of circles, there are two things that I would like to note. One, in my opinion, there is no way one could have inferred just from this passage, what exactly the author meant by this line or by this phrase, the middle of the circle of circles. One, two, so far as the purpose of reading this passage is concerned, which is to answer the questions that follow the passage, it was not even required to understand this particular line, because no question pertains directly to this particular line, right? So it was unlikely that anyone could have understood this, and it was also not required. Okay, then that begs the question, why am I explaining this here? Because that's just for the sake of clarity. I want to be clear. I want you guys, the viewers who are watching this video, to be very clear about the each and every point, each and every term that has been mentioned in the passage. That's the reason why I'm explaining this to you. Okay, with these disclaimers beforehand. Okay, so let's start. Now, at the time when the Britishers colonized the Indian subcontinent, and at that point of time, the author has described the political dynamic. What exactly was the political dynamic in the country? How the kingdoms used to manage their territories, etc. So what he says is, so the way he has described it is he's used a geometrical representation of that to describe that. He says that India was basically comprised of multiple diverse groups in terms of on varied basis of classification like caste, creed, religion, etc., language, etc. So there were these circles represent a variety of such groups which lived together in the same geographical region, in the same geopolitical space, and they were governed by one central authority, the king, right? To whom this whole region, the whole kingdom belonged, right? So it was governed by this king, and the nature of governance at that point of time in the country was such that this central authority, the king, would not really interfere so much into the day-to-day work of these groups, of its subjects, basically, right? The only interaction would be limited, or interfacing would be limited to either taxes, rents, and maybe protecting them from external armies, or maybe some pomp and show for celebration. So the control exercised by the kingdoms at that point of time over these varied groups on the ground level was quite marginalized. Okay, it was quite marginalized. The control was quite marginalized. They never really used to get into the day-to-day and ground level workings of what exactly is going on, right? So and then they were mainly about eminence. They were, right. The kingdom or the central authority was mainly about eminence. Okay, he's the king. He's gonna govern everything. He's the ultimate person who owns the geopolitical arena. Okay, but so it was limited to eminence. So two characteristics. One, it was mainly about eminence. Two, it was marginalized, right? It did not interfere into the day-to-day workings of these groups. This is what he calls the circle of circles. Okay, these circles are what represent the varied groups. Okay, you're gonna have to bear with my handwriting. And this point here, the center point, which represents the kingdom or the central authority, okay, is what the author means when he says the high ground in the middle of the circle of circles. Okay, so the circle of circles, this is the circle of circles, and this is the high ground in the middle of the circle of circles. So when he said that at first the new colonial apparatus exercised caution. Okay, so at first what the Britishers did was they simply acquired this central high ground in the middle of the circle of circles. They did not go on and rampage the whole geographical area, the groups which were living in the country, the people who lived in the country. They first simply, very cautionary, by a combination of military power and diplomacy, they just acquired this high ground of the circle of circles, and then after they could not, and then so once they did that, they could not really retain or sustain the method of governance that the old kingdom had deployed, right? Which was that of just being not interfering too much. Okay, they could not they could not keep up with this self-denying attitude that because they were representatives of the Enlightenment rationalism, which had restructured everything in Europe, they were not able to, this way of not interfering too much and just going or for eminence and being marginalized did not sit well with them, and hence they started restructuring the whole arena as they had done in Europe. Okay, that's what it means. Let's come to the next part. Okay, so coming to the next para. Consequently, the colonial state could not settle simply for eminence at the cost of its marginality. Okay, so that's what we discussed in the last slide, right? So like it was given that it was a representative of the great colonial discourse that used to transform and restructure everything that came in its way, interfering. So it could not, being the representative of such a discourse, it was not in a position where it could remain in an accept that self-denying attitude and then just remain marginalized and just settle for eminence. That okay, I will not interfere. That we will not interfere into the day-to-day workings of the groups. We will just allow us, just consider us to be the eminent rulers of the state, and we will not interfere in any of this. It was not okay with that. It right because okay, so it could not settle for eminence at the cost of marginality. It needed to interfere and transform everything according to its own intellectual ideas. Okay, so it says it began, and that it thus began to take initiatives to introduce the logic of modernity into Indian society. So it thus began to take initiatives to introduce the logic of modernity into the Indian society. Now, this is, by the way, guys, the second strategy. The first strategy was about being cautious and using military power and a combination of diplomacy to acquire the high ground. And then the second strategy is then you start from after that point you start transforming everything, right? That was the second strategy. So okay, so it began to take initiatives to introduce the logic of modernity into Indian society. Sometimes its initiatives, however, were resisted by pre-existing cultural forms. So sometimes these initiatives were resisted by pre-existing cultural forms. And at times there was a more direct form of collective resistance. And at times there was a more different direct form of collective resistance. So basically, this imposition of the external logic of modernity was resisted in multiple forms. That's what the author has mentioned. Therefore, and hence, as a result of this resistance, because the process of deploying modernity from as an external force was not so smooth, there was a resistance encountered. Therefore, the map of continuity and discontinuity that the state left, that this British colonial state left once they left after independence, once they left the country, the map of continuity and discontinuity that the state left was rather complex and has to be traced with care. So as a result of the discontinuity and continuity and the haphazardness that resulted due to the struggle between that external force and the resistance on part of the Indians, it resulted in this India was almost rendered in a very haphazard state. You know, there was some continuity somewhere, there was some discontinuity and some chaos at other places. We're talking about the geopolitical domain and the in terms of ideas, in terms of the economy, society, culture, etc. Right? So that's why this INDIA became IND here. IA. I have tried to represent this idea of chaos and continuity by displacing these letters here. So once they left India in this kind of a state, and hence which is a very complex state, and hence should be traced with care. So that's what the author means to say here. So in the first paragraph, let's just very quickly note what the author has done. He first talks about the two strategies of the British colonial state, their policies. He talks about how second second owing to how there was a contradiction, in the with respect to the first strategy, owing to the second strategy, owing to the great colonial discourse, of whose the British colonial state were representatives. And finally, he talks about that all of this application of external force and the resistance on part of the Indians, it resulted in India becoming a fuzzy state in a sense, right? A combination of continuity and discontinuity, and which is a very complex structure and should be traced with care. Okay. All right. Let's come to the next para then. Okay. So coming to the next paragraph. Most significantly, of course, initiatives for modernity came to assume an external character. The acceptance of modernity came to be connected ineradicably with subjection. Okay. So, what does the author mean to say by this sentence? See, guys, there are two points he has clarified here. He says that because modernity was introduced externally to the Indian people, they started associating an external character with the idea of modernity, right? So because their encounter with modernity was in a context where it was being imposed onto them, right? They anyways they ended up assuming that modernity is an external force. Okay, they equated both the items, that modernity can only come from outside. It is not as opposed to being something that one can grow into or one can develop organically by themselves. So that's the first idea. Next, and the acceptance of this modernity, which they have assumed to have an external character, acceptance of this modernity came to be construed as an instance of subjugation. Subjugation is subjugation, being subjugated by instance of subjection, which is basically being subjugated by a more powerful group, right? So modernity. So two points. Modernity. They started associating the idea of external of an external character with modernity, and they started associating with the idea of accepting this modernity the essence of getting subjugated by someone. That means if you're accepting this external idea of modernity, that means you're getting subjugated by a more powerful group or by a more powerful person, right? So these are the 2 points that he mentions. Coming to the next part. Next, this again points to two different problems. This again points to two different problems. One theoretical, the other political. Theoretically, now he first talks about the theoretical problem here. Theoretically, because modernity was externally introduced, it is explanatorily unhelpful to apply the logical format of the transition process to this pattern of change. Okay, so what the author has said here is that because, well, there are two problems that arise due to this concern, due to this whole association of modernity with external and acceptance of modernity with the subjection idea. That, and the one is a theoretical problem, the other is a political problem. He ends up, at least so far as this passage is concerned, he ends up talking only about the theoretical problem. He never gets to get to the political problem, as you will see later. So that he describes the theoretical problem in this sentence. He says that because modernity was introduced as an external force, was introduced from outside, we cannot apply the transition process to understand the change that India went through here, right? Because, so what he means by that is that the transition process is a process that can only be applied to cases where the change has happened endogenously, or where the change has happened organically by itself without being subjugated to any external forces. Okay, and because that does not apply here, because in this case there were external forces involved here, the change was not something that happened by itself from inside, from within, organically, endogenously. Hence, the transition process, it will be wrong to apply the transition process here. Okay. In the next sentence, the author says, such a logical format would be wrong on two accounts. First, however, certainly it would imply that what was proposed to be built was something like European capitalism. Okay, and in any case, historians have forcefully argued that what it was to replace was not like feudalism with or without modificatory adjectives. Okay, so in this sentence, the author has in the earlier sentence, the author first says that such an application of this logical format will be incorrect on two accounts, and then he goes on to describe the first account here. Okay, as part of describing the first account, he says that the application of this logical format will imply that what was being proposed to be built as a result of this intervention, as a result of this interference, as a result of these external forces, was something similar to European capitalism, which is definitely not the case. When the Britishers left India, they left it in a very almost a chaotic mixture of discontinuity and continuity, as the author has already noted here. So what was being proposed, it would imply that it was that which was being proposed to be built was European capitalism, which is incorrect, and hence the application of this logical format here is wrong. Also, that which they were trying, that which they altered or that which they changed, that means the state that India was in before they came in, it would also imply that the state was that of feudalism, which was definitely not the case. So again, once again, neither what neither what was being proposed to be built was European capitalism, nor that which was being changed was a case of feudalism. So the outcome as well as the initial state are not applicable here. Something that the logical format, if you apply it here, would imply, right? So if you apply the logical format here, it will imply that the initial state was feudalism and the proposed state was European capitalism. Neither of these ideas are true, and hence the logical format, hence the first point why the logical format is not applicable here. Okay, that's what he means to say. Coming to the next part, but more fundamentally, and then he talks about the second point. So the second point why this is not applicable here, and that's the more fundamental point. He believes the logical structure of endogenous change does not apply here. The logical structure of endogenous change, guys, endogenous change is change that happens from inside without the without the use of any external force, without any kind of external force being in the picture. Any change that happens by itself in a system, that is an endogenous change, as opposed to an exogenous change that comes from outside, that is forced upon from outside. Okay, so he says that the more fundamental reason why this structure cannot be applied here is because the logical structure of the endogenous change which is required for this process is not true here. The change here was forced, was exogenous, was not endogenous, and this idea or format is applied only to endogenous changes. That's something that we can infer. So, but more fundamentally, the logical structure of endogenous change does not apply here. Here, the transformation agendas attack as an external force. Okay, so I hope that's clear. So, what the author has noted here. So, the second point is change is not endogenous, and finally, what the 2 points that the author has noted here is first, in this paragraph, in this part of the second paragraph, the author has one point he has noted is there was the people started attributing or conceptualizing modernity in a distorted manner, first, and second, how the logical format of the transition process is not applicable in this case, and what are the reasons. Okay, that's what he talks about in this paragraph. Let's move on to the next one. Coming to the last part of the paragraph, the author says, this externality is not something that can be casually mentioned and forgotten. It is inscribed on every move, every object, every proposal, every legislative act. Each line of causality, it comes to be marked on the epoch itself. The repetitive emphasis on externality should not be seen as the nationalist initiative that is so well rehearsed in Indian social science. Okay, so guys, here what the author in the first three sentences, I'll split this into two parts. The first part is the first three sentences up until here, the epoch itself. This is where the author tries to convey to us the significance of this idea of externality. He basically says that this idea of externality is not something that should be treated casually. It's something that is inscribed on every move, every object, every proposal. It's something that has essentially shaped the nation, the path the nation followed thereon, right? So it has to be looked at in a very crucial light. Okay, that's one. And then in the later part, he cautions the reader. He says that, okay, so I have been emphasizing so much on externality, but please don't misinterpret this emphasis of mine on externality as being a case of nationalist initiative that is so well rehearsed in the Indian social science. Okay, so what does he mean by that? He basically says that, okay, it might seem like that I have been critical and I've about the idea of externality of the external forces being deployed, or I've at least considered them to be crucial. And from that, it is likely that you might interpret that I probably have a nationalistic agenda here. Nationalistic agenda in the sense that I'm trying to propose that the people of the nation themselves should have come together, gotten united, and maybe done something for the nation itself, right? Like that's what nationalistic agenda here means. So he says that I don't mean to say any of that. I don't mean to say any such point that the people should have, that is in favor of making a nationalist group, or bringing the people together in national interests. It's not that he's opposed to it, but the author basically means that at least he's being silent about that. He doesn't mean to emphasize on the idea of externality so that he can emphasize the nationalist agenda or nationalist initiative. His emphasis on externality is an objective observation, and he simply cautions the reader, please don't misinterpret it as a nationalistic initiative on my part. Okay, so I'm just making an observation about the externality of the nature of the application of the logic of modernity. Nothing to do, it has nothing to do with any kind of nationalistic initiative. Okay, which he also observes is so common in the Indian social sciences. Yes, so this is not the case. It might be common there, but this is not the case. Okay, coming to the next part. So next he says, quite apart from the externality of the entire historical approach, historical proposal of modernity, some of its contents were remarkable. Okay, so what he means to say here is that apart from this whole idea of a proposal of the logic of modernity having an external character being applied from the outside, apart from that external, the points related to the externality of the modernity, apart from that, there are some other aspects of modernity which are which are worth considering. But guys, he has not used the word remarkable here in a positive connotation. The word remarkable is usually used in a positive connotation. Okay, it's something remarkable. Wow, wonderful. No, that's not the connotation he has used in it. He's used it in a more objective connotation. He has said that he basically says it's something that should be noticed, that is noteworthy, that is worth a remark, as in remarkable. Okay, so he says that quite apart from the externality of, apart from all of this, of the entire historical proposal of modernity, some of its contents were remarkable. And what are they? He then lists them. Economic reforms, or rather alterations, did not foreshadow the construction of a classical capitalist economy with its necessary emphasis on extractive and transport sectors. What happened rather was the creation of a degenerate version of capitalism, what early dependency theorists called the development of underdevelopment. Okay, so this is what he says. So what he says is, okay, what are the other remarkable aspects? He notes them, that the economic alterations that were brought about in the country by the Britishers, by the colonialists, they did not foreshadow or gave as an output a case of classical. They did not result in a case of classical capitalism. Like he has also said that like something similar to European capitalism, maybe. Okay, but rather, so it rather resulted in a degenerate form of capitalism. Okay, instead of, right, so the economic alterations that were made by the Britishers in the Indian context at that point of time, they did not lead to or foreshadow a classical capitalist economy, okay, which may have been at least to some extent a positive outcome, but rather led to a degenerate version of developing a degenerate version of capitalism, and which to which many early dependency theorists have called, which many early dependency theorists have regarded as the development of underdevelopment, right? So they basically left. He seems to imply that they left the country in a state of underdevelopment. Okay, so yeah, so that's your explanation of the passage. Okay, now before we move on to the central idea, let's just quickly note the flow of ideas in the passage. The author starts with talking about the two strategies of the British colonial state, then talks about how the second one is in contradiction to the first, and he lists the reason. We are not going through the details of that again. Already discussed that. Then next he talks about how the outcome left India in a kind of a fuzzy state, an area of continuity and discontinuity. That was the first paragraph. That's what the first paragraph is about, these 3 points. Second paragraph, he talks about how the idea of modernity got distorted so far as the perception of the Indians was concerned. And then he talks about how the transition process is not applicable in this case of change of in this case where the change was brought about in India by an external force. So the transition process is not applicable here. And finally, he talks about some other aspects of uh, other remarkable or noteworthy aspects of modernity. Okay, so yeah, so that's your flow of ideas of the passage. Let's move on to the central idea. Guys, the central idea of the passage can be summarized in the following lines. As a representative of the great colonial discourse of Enlightenment rationalism, the British colonial state forced external or inorganic changes onto India, which ended up distorting the social and economic dynamics of the country. That will be your central idea. Okay, so with that, we come to the end of the video, guys. Now, for those of you who have not attempted the questions, you can attempt the questions by going to the link in the description of the video. It will, if you when you click on the link, it will take you to an interface where you can attempt the questions. And once you've attempted the questions, and you can move on to the second part of the video where I discuss the questions of the passage in detail. Okay. Again, those who have not seen the intro video or want to check out the complete playlist of all of these cat passages, you can click here on this side. This will lead you to the playlist, to the complete playlist, which has all the videos, and the description of those videos also has the links to attempt those passages. So you can do that. Also, yeah, subscribe to the channel. So that will definitely help. All right. Thank you, guys. See you in the next one.